Hello there, and thank you for joining us on tonight's edition of Sunday Interview. Sitting in for your usual presenter, Grivazio Zulu, I am Franklin Tambo Jr. Now, Zambia has reached a debt restructuring agreement, and this was revealed in Paris, France, when a group of 20 nations, or G20, agreed to restructure the country's debt repayment. President Hakainde Hichilema has described this milestone as a win for the nation. Tonight, we host Andrew Chibuye, who is a country senior partner for PricewaterhouseCoopers Zambia, or PwC Zambia, and has been with the firm for over 19 years. He's a fellow of the Zambia Institute of Chartered Accountants, an associate of the Association of Chartered Accountants, and a holder of a Master of Business Administration MBA from the Alliance Manchester Business School. I want to welcome you to the program.
Thank you very much, Franklin. It's good to be here.
Good to have you. And Mr. Chibuye is also author of various economic and sector thought leadership publications. Now, let's get straight to it, because this is a matter that has drawn a lot of attention, which is being closely followed, a lot of need for understanding. In a nutshell, if just for the sake of clarity, what does this mean for the country?
So what this means, basically, I mean, we've known that Zambia has had a challenge with regards its debt situation. If you go back a number of years, we had a situation where debt was becoming unsustainable. That culminated in actual default on fairly significant obligations in about November 2020. Now, when you've defaulted on your obligations, it has consequences for you, the borrower, all right? In terms of how we're perceived by global financial markets, how we're perceived by our partners, and just generally the credibility of the country. There was then a process, and that was accelerated post the election of the UPND government, to get some agreement with the creditors, basically to come to some sort of understanding around how the problem that was there would be resolved. And that has been something that has been building up over time, from first getting into a program with the IMF, basically to help restore credibility to Zambia's economic performance and outlook, to provide assurance to external parties, including creditors, that Zambia is reforming and is on the path to getting its house in order, if I can put it that way. And then getting into the nitty-gritty of actually agreeing how the debt would be dismantled. So what we had last week was an announcement that the official creditors, in this case we've been given a figure accounting for about $6.3 billion, have come to an agreement on how Zambia's problem regarding those debts which are owed to bilateral creditors will now be dismantled. Those bilateral creditors are part of the overall picture. So if you look at the numbers that have been put out, there's a total debt which is being considered of about $12.8 billion. 6.3 billion is official creditors. So these are bilateral creditors between government to government and various countries, okay? There is another 6.5 billion, which is commercial creditors, okay? So holders of Euro bonds, banks, etc. But what the importance is of the agreement that was announced is that that agreement was undertaken under what's known as the G20 Common Framework for Debt Restructuring, okay? Now that G20 framework for restructuring basically gives an overall guidance to the creditors around what the creditors are agreeing as a framework, or the principles that everyone now that Zambia owes money will likely abide to, all right? So it makes the process a bit more straightforward. So that's basically where we are.
Some have argued that perhaps putting the obligation under this framework may not exactly be the best idea.
Yeah.
And that's because the country has different loan obligations with different creditors.
Yeah.
And that this puts the country at a disadvantage, especially with bilateral creditors.
Yeah, yeah.
Would you agree?
First, I'd like to contextualize it. Then we cannot draw our own conclusions, right? the reason why I think we have some of these conversations is that we're not really relating to the problem, all right? When you say Zambia owes, who's Zambia? It's me and you, Franklin, right? So it's us as a country. This process has taken this long. Why? It's a complicated process. Why has it been this complicated? It's been this complicated for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is the number of creditors that Zambia owes, also the varied nature of those creditors. So we owe other governments. When you say you owe other governments, who do you owe? You owe the citizens of that country, okay? Which means when the government representative is coming to negotiate with Zambia, they're standing representing their citizenry, right? If Zambia lent money to another country, me and you as citizens would be interested in how it gets resolved, correct? Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it's our money, it's our taxpayers' money that's been given to another country. That country has defaulted. You then have actual financial institutions. Who are those financial institutions? When we talk about Eurobond creditors, who are we talking about? A Eurobond creditor is a fund manager who took money from pensioners and came and gave it to Zambia, all right? Those pensioners, imagine if NAPSA lent money to another country, okay, for a project. And then that country or whoever they lent to says, we can't pay. How would you feel as a contributor to the pension fund?
But that's talking about...
Yeah, so I'm coming to it. So you've got this complexity around the number and the diversity of those creditors. Now you've got two options. You go one by one and talk to them, or you put them together and have the fewest number of conversations with representatives of these creditors. In this case, two, broadly speaking, all right? The official creditors, which was co-chaired by China and France, deputy chaired by South Africa, and the commercial creditors. Now, what you're doing is, instead of going, when you go one at a time, it's now up to you to have individual conversations. When you agree with creditor A, you go to creditor B, all right? You may have agreed with creditor A. If creditor B hears that you've given slightly more favorable, creditor B has negotiated better, and you've ended up with slightly more favorable terms for the creditor in the second instance, what stops them from coming back and say, I also want those conditions? The way that the situation that we have now is that once the framework is agreed, then all the creditors will basically be bound by what has been agreed as an overall framework. It's more efficient, actually, to go about it this way. Yes, it's taken long, and part of it is this framework had never been tested before. Zambia is a pioneer in as far as restructuring debt under the G20 common framework is concerned. So if you ask me, now answer your question, I definitely believe it's the best way to go. It's a more efficient process. It then provides greater certainty. It minimizes the likelihood that one creditor will demand something which the first creditor didn't, and the first creditor then gets wind of it and also wants those terms. Remember, everyone is looking out for their interest. The reason why I was defining who are those creditors, because then you need to be thinking about what is the likely motivation of a fund manager representing pensioners. Right? So those sorts of complications is what...
And that's understandable. Many cannot help but relate what happened in, say, the Mwanawasa government when the $7 billion was written off to what? To zero. Yeah. Those were bilateral.
But mainly bilateral credits.
Right? Yes. And one would have thought that considering the 6.3 billion is owed to bilateral creditors, that you would not want to put them in one frame because some creditors might be friendlier than others. Therefore, a one-on-one approach perhaps could result into different responses. That you've put a country at a disadvantage by putting everybody in one frame.
I mean, that's one way of looking at it, but there's no way of telling. I've given you the situation, I've given you the scenario. Who are bilateral creditors? We need to realize, especially post-COVID, all countries have got their own pressures, right? They've got demands that citizens are placing on them about increasing social spending, increasing social support for their own countries, okay? You've heard of discussions around pressures from the developed nations regarding things like continuing to provide donor support, right? Why? Because their citizens are making demands on them, right? They're making demands on the governments. And a government who is a function of a political process must listen to its citizens. So there's nothing to say that the situation then and the situation today are the same, because the demands of the citizenry are very different. You can't account for it that way. So it may be that one or two could give you more favorable concessions. But what you're most interested in is a certainty. And the certainty that comes with, once you've agreed a framework, you then know how you can apply it to the entire population of your creditors. Mind you, the official creditors, for us to get onto an IMF program, the official creditors had already said, we will do what we must to give Zambia debt relief, which will allow for its debt to be sustainable. So that assurance was already provided at the point when Zambia entered into an IMF program. What's been happening between now and then is now working out those modalities, because there are different ways to achieve the same outcome, right? And that's basically what it is. So I believe it's the most efficient process. I think where it's been a challenge, and His Excellency referenced it, is it's been the first time the G20 framework is being applied. So hopefully going forward, those who come after us may have it a bit easier. And more importantly, hopefully we don't end up in this situation again.
So the expectation is that there'll be unlocking of resources to steer or trigger development in various sectors and just national development. But at the same time, there's an argument that there is no money in the coffers. The issues of certain obligations to do with, for example, the backlog that is in the country's face following the moratorium on servicing debt.
Yeah.
What should this expectation be managed with caution then?
Well, you have to understand, first and foremost, you can't allow the situation where you're not paying creditors to perpetuate. It can't. So we start with that premise. At some point, you have to fix the problem. This problem has how many parts to it? Let's assume we're not paying our creditors, so there's a principal amount that we owe and an interest amount, right? Some of it would have accrued in arrears, so you haven't been servicing. So what was due in installments, you haven't paid, and then there's the rest which is yet to accrue, but you already know if you've got a problem with what's due so far, obviously you have a problem going forward. So what am I saying? Relief has been given. What is that relief? The relief is that the tenor or the period over which the country is expected to repay is going to increase, okay? So up to at least 20 years, they say. In the first 3 years, only servicing interest, et cetera, et cetera. So what's going to happen is that instead of paying, for example, $10 million repayment, maybe your net repayment comes down to 2. You've got 8, which you no longer need to pay, and then you spread that out over the period. Now your question, there are no resources, right? Or what exactly is happening? A number of different things need to happen. If you look at Zambia's budget for 2023, it's 167 million kwacha budget in terms of expenditure. That budget includes in it debt service, all right? So what I expect the team at the Ministry of Finance now they'll be doing, they'll be recalibrating that budget, okay? So because now they know how much exactly, or they'll know soon, once all the negotiations and agreements have been done, how much actually needs to be paid this year, next year, and into the future, all right? What that then means is the Honorable Minister of Finance can make a decision, say, all right, these savings, which we are realizing in actual outflow that we needed to make. Remember the premise is you can't leave debt, you can't stay in default perpetually, right? What are we going to do? Number one, he could say, we will use it to buffer our fiscal position, so we won't spend it, all right? In which case, your total budgeted expenditure will come down. He could say, we're going to spend it, and we'll spend it on recurring expenditure, or we're going to spend it, and we're going to spend it to stimulate the economy, or a combination of these, right? Or any number of issues, or some of it to channel to accelerate other programs. And when you do that, what are you doing? You're basically reconstructing your budget. You're reducing the amount of money that you need to go and borrow from the domestic market in order to finance your budget. That being one of the biggest challenges that we have in the country at the moment, because the amount of borrowing that government would have had to do in the domestic market to sort out the budget is what has been driving interest rates up. Because where does the government get that money? They get it from banks, they get it from financial institutions who are willing to give money to the government as opposed to give it to me and you, Franklin. all of that will then mean that the dynamics in the economy will start to change. If government brings down the amount that is borrowing, ultimately you should see a reduction as well in things like interest rates. So there are certain linkages that this brings about, which, if we capitalize on them, should then lead to overall stimulation in the economy.
Right. The issue about falling into debt, I mean, it dates back, and there is no guarantee that this will happen. What exactly drives the country into debt been critically looked at? Let's look at procurement, for example, and what it turns out to be. There's a project, and at the end of the day, it's turned into or transforms into some sort of debt. Is the issue of procurement part of the problem here?
I mean, there's a number of issues which are part of the issue, which are part of the root cause, right? And it's my hope that a diagnostic has been or will be done, and I'm pretty sure that has happened, right? But we start with the premise also that debt in itself is not a bad thing, right? Debt, if you borrow someone's money, if you borrow money and use it to make your own money, use it to build assets that are productive and contribute to your overall well-being as an individual, that's genius, isn't it? Right? That's one of the that's like a dream. I use your money to make money for myself, then I pay you back and remain with the assets. That's fantastic, right? Now, you've mentioned the issue of procurement. Obviously, that needs to be interrogated. How is it that you go through an entire process and arrive at an answer regarding what should be procured that subsequently needs to be looked back and say, actually, did we get the best deal? Did we get the best quality? And I think it's clear that that is a priority from a procurement perspective in terms of reforming that. I think the other thing which is very notable, which the government has done, is the Public Debt Management Act that is now enforced as law, where for the government to contract debt, there's a lot more disclosure, transparency, and engagement, especially with Parliament, basically, to justify what happened, to come back and report, this is what we said we were going to do, this is what we actually did, so that it's a lot clearer. Is money going to its intended purpose? I think the other challenge is making sure that any project that's undertaken where a borrowing is done, that's irrespective of whether that borrowing is concessional or commercial, must have a very clear and justified economic business case. That if we borrow for this project, will this project pay itself off over time? Or will it contribute to the pot which will allow for it to be serviced over time? That has been part of the challenge that we have at the moment, where we are not able to fully demonstrate that all the assets that were invested in have subsequently been economically viable and contributing to the pot. In fact, it looks as though they've actually been a drain on the overall coffers. So procurement is big, debt reform and restructuring is big. Reviewing the whole process of who do you contract debt from and for how long and for what, all of that needs to be reviewed, in addition to things like how do you rationalize your current operations, because sometimes when you're able to borrow freely, it also makes you a bit careless on how you're spending money. So being very diligent on how you spend so that you don't end up in situations where you do have to go and borrow is fundamental.
We'd like to invite callers to ask you questions on the program. Our WhatsApp line is 097-3433-802. That's 097-3433-802. Or indeed, you could call us just now on 0211 253025, 253025. Please come through, and your question and indeed contribution could be addressed here. There's interest here in what the main areas are in this country that drive this country into debt. Would you be able to kind of give an idea of what the main areas that drive Zambia into debt?
I mean, it's pretty obvious. In the recent past, it was infrastructure investment, right? Infrastructure investment on its own is not a bad thing. Every country, in order to be viable, sustainable, continue to grow, must invest in infrastructure. Granted, okay? The question is, what type of infrastructure? Is it economically viable? is it constructed at the right price? Because remember, even when you have an economically viable project, if you overinvest in it, that overinvestment is reflected in its ability to generate it. Let's make it simple, right? It's a good thing to build a house for rent, okay? In a certain area, if the maximum rent you're going to get is, say, 3,000 kwacha per month, the minimum that you need to construct a house that generates 3,000 kwacha, maybe it's 200,000 kwacha. If you go and invest 400,000 kwacha in that property, it doesn't matter. You still only generate 3,000 kwacha. What you have done is effectively you have wasted 200,000 kwacha of your investment, if you follow that logic. The same thing applies if you are going to invest in infrastructure. If the economic potential of particular infrastructure is only $100 million, and you need to invest, if you need to invest, say, $50 million so that you generate $100 million over its lifetime. If you go and invest 200, it doesn't matter. It will only ever generate that amount which has been set for that, what is actually possible for it. So it's that which then leads to wastage and loss ultimately in value, because that then translates in your inability to service the debt going forward. So very important that infrastructure is looked at. We still need infrastructure, very important, but how you go about investing it. I think that's why, for example, the PPP model is now being championed as one of the key drivers. I think other areas which are fundamental is if you are borrowing for consumption, okay, recurrent expenditure. You are borrowing and you are spending on expenditure, you are spending on things that are not necessarily revenue generating or do not generate revenue in the same time period that that particular obligation needs to be serviced. That's also dangerous in terms of borrowing practices. So it's very important that the country over time looks at how to generate sufficient internal revenue resources which can cover these expenditures so that you don't have any pressure to borrow. But by and large, in the recent past, the biggest cause of the problem seems to have been infrastructure investment.
There's some people who would like to know the debt restructuring versus the cost of debt. Can you highlight that?
Debt restructuring versus the cost of debt. Maybe if you could just clarify a bit.
If you compare what it will cost over time, it's expected that.
Okay.
Yes, right.
I get it. Okay, so you need to understand how this process has unfolded. There's a lot of science to it. All right. The way that this was done, in terms of how much relief does Zambia need? Okay, that's the starting point. The goal is to make Zambia's debt sustainable. What does it mean to make debt sustainable? It means Zambia must be able to service its debt without there being detrimental effects on the rest of its operations. Okay, simple. That's what debt sustainability is. So especially this is a World Bank process supported by the IMF. There's what's called the debt sustainability analysis, where they look at Zambia. They look at its economic performance, economic position, and they say, based on this outlook that Zambia has, the amount of debt that Zambia can carry comfortably is X. Okay? For argument's sake, let's assume that number is 6.3 billion. Okay? Based on what we see, the size of the GDP, tax collections, non-tax revenues collected, the population size, all of that put together, the mineral potential, the outlook, put that all in one basket. You come and say, this is what Zambia's debt carrying capacity is. Then they say, what is Zambia's actual debt? Zambia's actual debt, for argument's sake, maybe is 10, right? Debt carrying capacity, 6. This difference of 4 needs to be dealt with. How do you deal with this difference of 4? There are different ways. Number one, you actually say, okay, you owe 10, but we the creditors have agreed, we'll write off equivalent of 4. That is your haircut. Or you say, well, we won't write off, but instead of you paying over 10 years, you pay over 20 years. Now you and I know that a kwacha today and a kwacha in 10 years' time are different. That is called the present value of money, right? So when you account for that, you still end up with the same effect over a longer period, okay? Where you still pay the 10, but because you've paid it out over a longer period, you now end up with, in real terms, you've only ever paid out 6, right? So that difference you have achieved. Or you can do a combination of the two, right? Where you say, we'll give you a haircut and we'll give you
Right. Let me bring in a caller, Kerry, I believe, calling in from Roma here in Lusaka. Please go ahead. Good evening.
Good evening. Good evening, Chairman. Thank you very much for the presentation Mr. Shuni has given. I'm really grateful. During the course of the day, I was struggling to understand by retro borrowing. And with that in mind, I want to find out, how do the government protect itself from further borrowing? In this instance, I want to say that let's assume that the current government loses election in 2031 and the new government comes in, and then they continue borrowing excessively, just like the previous regime did. How do you protect that from happening again?
Right.
So that's more tonight.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming through.
Thank you, sir.
So, it's been growing with every...
Yeah, so I've got to the question. So how do we guard against one government takes us in this direction, the next in the other direction? So let's look at it very practically, where we are at the moment, right? So first and foremost, there are agreements that will be signed with the creditors, okay? So there's an MOU, but then it will be followed up with creditor to Zambian government one-on-one agreements. Those agreements will be binding on the government. That means we'll continue to service. Number two, there's laws that have been put in place. I've given you an example of the debt management bill, as well as for example, what will be happening around procurement reviews. So that law hopefully remains to give us that continued certainty. I think what is also critical, as I reflect on this question, is really the strength of institutions, okay? The strength of institutions. And in the long term, maybe even just in the medium to long term, Zambia must do a lot more to strengthen institutions. Which institutions am I talking about? Obviously, Parliament as a starting point, and its ability to police what the executive is doing, especially in terms of some of these financial decisions, right? So do they have that capacity? Part of what that debt management bill proposes is the establishment of a debt management office, which is meant to be key in this process. You think of institutions like the Central Bank and the Bank of Zambia, which is the advisor to government when it comes to financial and economic issues. We've already seen some actions there around things like securing things like security of the Office of Tenure of the Bank of Zambia Governor. That is a very important office in terms of what is happening here. I think also very important is we, the citizens, all right? We have to take a keen interest in what is happening, our economic affairs, civil society, and just the general citizenry.
Right.
We need to have a lot more interest, engagement, and holding our leaders accountable on this particular issue.
Let's bring in Mr. Mwanza. Mr. Mwanza, calling you from within Osaka. Thank you for joining us. Please go ahead.
Hello.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us. Please go ahead.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening to you. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, sure. I just want to find out that is there any guarantee that the next government that will come in will be able to repay these debts without any difficulties? And if they fail to repay, what will be the position there?
So that's a very good question, very fundamental. The way that you need to understand if you look at starting from the extended credit facility in terms of how it's structured, plus what we know so far coming out of the official creditors and the framework within which this debt restructure has been done, is that it's meant to be dynamic. What do I mean? They're meant to be periodic assessments to assess Zambia's debt carrying capacity and adjust accordingly. What the communique says so far is an intention to accelerate if Zambia's fundamentals improve, okay? We'll wait and see what it says about, what the MOU says about in the event that there's a deterioration. But let's call a spade a spade. We've been given, there's commitment already that these debts will be spread out over at least 20 years, all right? In fact, the communique says at least. That's a long time, 20 years, right? That obviously straddles several governments. And this is, I think it's linked to the earlier comment that
Yeah.
we had. But the concern that's raised is, will the government actually have the capacity? And this is where the conversation needs to shift to. These savings that are going to be realized, this breathing space that the country has been given, how is it going to be used? There's a 3-year moratorium in which the country will not be servicing interest. Afterward, will only be servicing interest, not be servicing principal, and then after, will be servicing both. Can you imagine how bad it would be at the end of this period to go back to the creditors and say, actually, guys, we need to have another conversation, right? I'm not sure that we'll get much patience, right? And I think that's why there was a call even by His Excellency. One of the first statements that is made on arrival is, guys, we need to work hard. That's why there's that statement, that we need to work hard, we need to revamp and drive this economy forward so that we build that capacity to service this debt. Because we've been given as much latitude as you can be given. A few years ago, your debt was forgiven in full. Now your debt is being restructured, hardly 20 years later.
But,
so the issue really is Zambia's economy needs to grow. And that is where that's where the focus needs to be. So the question is contingent on what we do in the intervening period. Obviously, all the intent is to ensure that we repay. If you look at statements coming out of the likes of the IMF, they believe Zambia is already on course to growing its economy in order to make that impact and drive forward.
Let's bring in James. James, I believe, is calling in from Kitwe. Please go ahead.
Good evening. Thank you for the discussion. Thank you, Mr. Chibuye. The explanation is quite clear. I want to find out what lessons have we learned from this date and what is the way forward. Thank you so much.
I think there are a lot of lessons. They just have to be. So first and foremost, I think we've touched on a few of them. When you borrow, what are you borrowing for? Okay. I remember vividly the excitement that came with Zambia's first Euro bond, the $750 million. It's a good thing to actually be trusted with people's resources, to be seen as credit worthy so that credit is extended to you. But I guess it can also be an Achilles heel if you do not then apply those resources accordingly. So I think being very clear, what are we borrowing for? Is it economically viable? Will it pay for itself? I think the other factor that we need to always bear in mind is how do we factor in uncertainty and the shocks that are likely to come. Zambia's debt was sort of teetering on between unsustainable and completely unmanageable for a bit. When the COVID-19 pandemic came, it basically went over. That was like the straw that broke the camel's back. Right? So how much resilience are you building into your economy? How much resilience are you building into your society so that you're able to withstand shocks, things that are outside your control? So I think if you put it sort of into a framework, you can look at things which are within our control. How much do you borrow? When? For what? What's the justification? What's the accountability? Are we able to go back and say, when we borrowed our 3 billion euro bond, what was the business case? What was the argument that was put forward? How did we deploy it? There are lessons to be learned there. How did we go on a tangent?
Right.
And then the other bit is really around what I've said as well in terms of how do we insulate ourselves against potential shocks.
Well, let's bring in some messages. We have them coming through. We're paying, well, obviously they greet you. We're paying off debt arrears, put pressure on the currency in the short term and long term. You want to keep that, clip it. How is this going to help with the currency fluctuation? Right.
Very cool. Very, very, very good questions. I think
there's the others. We're paying off debt arrears, put pressure. We've got that.
Fluctuation.
What is the trickle-down effect of this debt restructuring program to the ordinary Zambian?
Okay.
I think that has also.
So let's look at currency and then impact on the local.
Right.
Yeah. So there's obviously been volatility generally in Zambia's macroeconomic environment, susceptible to sentiment, which has been positive and negative, and that has led to fluctuations. And one of my statements over a period of time has been, until Zambia's debt is restructured, volatility will be the order of the day. And we've seen that. Now we expect a bit more stability. So fluctuations should subside, because now what should drive where we are going is more the underlying economy. Debt restructure, yes, it will put some pressure on the currency simply because there's a demand, right? Because that demand has not been there since 2020. We have not been servicing debt. Now we need to start servicing that debt. So obviously there will be a need for currency to be available to make those payments. However, given the relief that we've been given, it's probably moderated. What you expect, what you hope is that on the other side, the economy is growing to compensate for any such fluctuations, right? So that's the issue with the currency. Hopefully better stability. Yes, there will be some pressure from a depreciation perspective, but you also hope that the economy compensates for that. The question of the common man, I think, is the most important. Because if the common man doesn't benefit from this, then what exactly is this all about? Now, the way to think about it is like I said, some of these things you need to make them relatable, right? If I, Franklin, am so indebted to you that I can't pay my children's school fees, I can't feed them properly, we can't go on holiday, right? My quality of lifestyle is compromised. If you, as my creditor, then give me some relief and say, okay, Andrew, I've heard what you've said, I'll give you some relief. Instead of paying me over 2 years, you pay me over 20, all right? The question is, what do I do with that resource? Can you already see that potentially my children will have a better quality of life if I deploy what I was supposed to pay to you in a manner that is wise, right? That's basically what's happening here. So the way that I see this debt restructure is probably at two levels. There's macros, which is attract foreign direct investment, attract more capital into Zambia. That's going to grow GDP, going to grow jobs, going to grow investment, foreign direct investment, you name it. But the common man on the street is saying, okay, how exactly does this relate to me? The second layer is there is obviously direct benefit that can be deployed to individuals and households. Will the CDF expand? Will there be better support? Will there be better health services? Will there be better education services? All of that should have a more direct impact to the common man.
Right.
Will there be some relief provided to employees, for example, which
Right.
is more direct? So it just depends how the government chooses to configure those savings.
Okay.
But you have macro benefits and then you have micro benefits as well. And I think it's the micro benefits that you and me are most looking for.
I want to bring in another caller. This one is Gift from within Lusaka. Well, welcome to the program, and please go ahead.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to ask, what is the long-term benefit of the debt restructuring? And then the other question is, how best is the media going to help in terms of educating the common man on the ground? Because I think you've seen, we've had wrangles where I think the church and the government were having wrangles in terms of explaining certain technicalities. So how best is the media going to do that?
All right.
First one.
Before that, let me get added to that. I want to get messages. Gold is very precious and expensive commodity. What is the government doing about the gold mines that are being found? Can't revenue from them speed up the payment of the country's debt? As you put that down, how long will it take to start seeing results of debt restructuring in relation to high cost of living? I've got a last one for you. Can you please explain to me how much was the debt, how much has been written off, how much should be paid, and the period in which it should be paid? Part of what you touched on earlier on. So I've got a lot of them, so I'd like you to answer those in a very quick sense.
Okay, media, fundamental in terms of driving understanding. Engagements like this hopefully continue, and a lot more. So we need to make it simple, we need to make it understandable. People need to appreciate, what does it mean for me, right? If you don't appreciate, you can't relate to it, then you're not going to be very clear, all right? So there are ways that, if we stick to facts, all right, try and understand what is actually happening. The first question was, what's the benefit of debt restructuring long term? First and foremost, if you are not credit-worthy, right, if you are not perceived as someone, what does that mean, all right? The trust that is bestowed on you is eroded. Your ability to invest, your ability to attract investment, anything you say can be questioned, right? Just imagine when you see someone who you know, everyone knows this guy is heavily indebted. What's their perception of them, right? It's that which is eroded. Now you start to rebuild that confidence. Hopefully in the short to medium term, you end up with a credit rating upgrade from credit rating agencies. That attracts more investment. It helps to lower the cost of capital. If you are lending to someone and you know this person is high risk, all right, what is your demand? You want collateral. You want a high interest rate. When that risk subsides, your demand subside. The challenge is that because Zambia has been perceived that way, it means Zambia has then been dependent, the government has been dependent on local markets to borrow. If it doesn't have to borrow as much from the local markets or can borrow at a lower rate, that is a benefit that can be passed on to the people. So there's definitely a massive benefit, not just from perception, but in terms of how it's executed. The media, there's a massive job to do. Professionals like myself also have to be very active in terms of helping people to understand the facts. Gold and other resources as a means of repayment. I think one thing that we need to be clear about is that just because you're on an IMF program and you're doing debt restructure, it doesn't mean you're not doing anything else within your control to try and raise revenues to service debt, right? It's like if I owe you money, right, and you give me a debt restructure, you say, okay, you pay me over 10 years. That doesn't stop me from perhaps looking for another job that could pay me more money or starting another business, because the intention should actually be for me to pay you in a shorter period.
I think when that question is posed for many Zambian, it's and whether it's in thinking in the ordinary sense or otherwise, is that when you put Zambia's resources together, there's gold, there are all these minerals that are being discovered. To some people, this is an issue that can be done one time, because in as far as the ordinary person is concerned, we must have, as a country, enough resources that surpass $6.3 billion.
Absolutely.
Where is the problem? Is that thinking too simplistically?
And that's my point. The fact that you have those resources doesn't mean that, because right now you've got a problem, that you don't have those access to those resources now. You need to restructure your debt now.
Right? Well, that is fair.
So that's fair.
That's fair.
Yeah.
But with regards to what the country has or endowed with,
yes, absolutely.
Is it an issue that should wait for 20 years, for example?
Absolutely not. And that's why I'm saying they're not mutually exclusive. So the task for us is to maximize our returns from these resources so that we're able to service our debt and do our own thing as a country. When you have debt hanging over your head, it means you're not free economically. So we need to divorce the issue of how do we maximize. They're not mutually exclusive. Maximizing our internal resources is not one process which is separate from debt restructure. As you restructure debt, make sure you are maximizing your internal resources. So the questions that will be, that's why the government has given away, has pronounced itself quite aggressively in terms of the types of incentives that are being given to mining, to manufacturing, to agriculture. Why? It's so that you capitalize on that resource so that you can use it not just to repay your debt, most importantly, to improve the quality of livelihoods for the people, to provide better services, and in the process, build an economy that is significant so that repaying debt is a non-issue.
Right. Yeah. Let's bring in Pilwe, calling in from within Lusaka. Please go ahead.
Good evening, gentlemen. Thank you very much for the discussion. There is an English saying that goes a little bit like this: there is no such thing as a free lunch. So while they have agreed to restructure our debt, I'm just wondering, is there anything that they're gaining from this? Are we going to have to pay at a higher interest? Or maybe, as the rumors have been in the past with the Chinese, are we going to have to forfeit a national utility like ESCO or something like that? So what is the negative issue them, or by having our debt being restructured? Because I believe everyone has to gain something from this. It's not only us as Zambians who are gaining, but I think they also want to gain something from us having our debt restructured. So can you please just make that a bit clearer for me, please?
Okay.
Yeah.
So what is the primary objective of someone who has lent money? Right? It's to get their money back with a return. Plain and simple, right? Money is lent in good faith. Money was lent in good faith. The terms and conditions of those lendings, most of them, Euro bonds, not all of them are publicly available, but it was, you pay me back what I've lent to you, and this is the interest rate. Simple. You haven't been paying me, all right? Which means I have lost as a creditor, all right? The creditors they've lost in the process. What is the primary drive at the moment? The primary drive at the moment is you pay me back. I will give you more time, but pay me back. It's better than you not paying me off at all. All right? So what is the upside in that process? A, they potentially get something out of this equation rather than losing out completely. All right? So that's the starting point. Then also remember, the way that these financial markets work is that it's possible you can start on this journey and they've told you we'll give you 20 plus years to pay back. Right? If the fundamentals improve significantly, there's things like debt refinancing, where the same creditors can come back to you and say, actually, we think you're now on the right path. Let's have a further discussion about what you owe us. Refinancing, they give you more money. Remember, theirs is to make money off money. Around the issue around, is there a risk that you could lose certain assets? I'm not sure, right, what some of the terms and conditions were. Right. The government has disputed that over time. But at the end of the day, the first thing is pay your debt. We need to pay our debts. We need to get, the only way that you can be at parity with creditors, the only way that you can confidently encounter your creditors is if you paid them in full. You wouldn't even have a problem. Right. Now that we do, it's about paying back. On their part, it's about getting back what they lent.
Let's see whether we can squeeze in another caller. From Luwansha. Good evening. Your name, please, and please go ahead.
Oh, my name is Hamakoko. Good evening, Franklin, and good evening, the gentleman.
Good evening.
I wanted to find out from a gentleman. He has explained quite well how the government wishes to handle the money we are owing the bilateral creditors. I also want him to explain a bit how we are going to deal with the other creditors, the commercial creditors. I think very little has been shared concerning the other amount that we are owing the commercial creditors. Thank you.
Right. So that's the other part, which obviously needs, because with commercial creditors, they're probably not interested in restructuring. Are they? Would they be?
On the contrary. On the contrary. And that is going back to the whole discussion around why this G20 common framework is important. Because this G20 common framework is not just for official creditors or bilateral creditors. It's for all creditors, including the commercial creditors. So if you look at the statement that's been given, the expectation is that the basis on which Zambia will renegotiate with the commercial creditors is similar to what's been announced. Treatment in form of moratorium, extension in repayment period. That's the whole essence. That is the benefit of doing this debt restructuring under the G20 common framework. Right. That all the creditors will have all of similar terms. Right. It won't be all of them are like for like, but the basic principles of how the debts will be restructured is the same.
Right. We could bring in another caller. Please introduce yourself. You're calling from Dollar Made to Believe. Please go ahead.
Good evening, gentlemen.
Good evening to you.
Yes, please. I think your guest has explained in very clear language. It is understood, but only to those who have good knowledge of English. Now, I think we all need to know what this means. Even those in the villages, those who do not understand the language. So it should be simplified to everybody so that we know where we are as a country. Otherwise, the explanation is very, very clear for us, for us who can understand what he's talking about. But for some of us, again, on the other side, I think it would be a more clearer, clarified, maybe in local languages. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. I suppose at this point, it's important to indicate what the next stage is. Yeah. The issue of now meeting creditors one-on-one, in a quick sense. Maybe that will help.
Okay. So very simple. Step one, there's a statement which has come out. Step two, there's a memorandum of understanding that will actually be drafted with the official creditors. Guys, this is what we've discussed. This is what we've agreed. This is how it will work. Then Zambia will then have agreements with each of its bilateral creditors because different amounts are owed. It's legally binding documentation that will show you owe this one 100 million, this one 50 million, this one 10 million. Each of those will be agreed separately. And then Zambia then starts to execute on what needs to happen, right? Obviously, in the process, you have interventions, reviews by the IMF, etc., and whatever frameworks the creditors will come up with to monitor implementation. The easiest is if we do what we say we'll do. If we say we're going to pay on this day X, we pay, then even the creditors don't need to do anything. Then there is the engagement with the private creditors. The private creditors, similar format. The overall framework is agreed. I'm not too sure if there'll be an MOU with the parties that represent them, but ultimately there will be engagement with each creditor for a separate agreement to be signed, and then that then starts to be implemented. The important thing is that they have said in principle, we agreed. Now it's the modalities of each and every creditor being agreed separately. So that is legally binding. Nobody can turn around in a few months or weeks' time, a year's time, saying, I want to change what I've agreed with Zambia.
Right. You remain optimistic?
Very, very optimistic. The debt restructure has been a significant overhang over the country. It's taken up a lot of time. I think this is the third or fourth time that I've come here discussing debt and things like that. It gives us the opportunity to move on and discuss and move to other conversations and focus on.
What about the skeptics?
They'll always be there. I think it's important that they are there. They need to ask challenging questions. And mind you, just because I'm optimistic, it doesn't mean I'm not going to ask tough questions. I've already got a few questions for the Honorable Minister of Finance, some things that I personally want to see as a citizen of Zambia in giving me assurance that Zambia is on the right path. To be skeptical, I mean, it is what it is. The results will speak for themselves. I think let's start from this. Is it a good thing that our creditors have agreed to give us a concession? That I think we all have to agree, yes. And hopefully we don't end up in this situation again. From there, it's really about what we do with this opportunity that we've been given.
I want to thank you for coming this evening.
Thank you very much.
And the viewers appreciate your explanation of this whole matter.
Thank you.
And we hope to
I'll
see
try
you.
Bemba next time, but I can't guarantee.
Well, I'm afraid that's it. And as far as the interview is concerned, we've been hosting Andrew Chibuye, country senior partner for PwC Zambia. And hopefully you've been able to understand what this whole issue of debt restructuring is all about. But like my guest has said, there are many questions that need to be answered, clarity that has to be made, and of course, for everybody to be involved. Thanks for watching Sunday Interview. See you next time.